The night before her wedding, Eleanor overheard her fiancé laughing with his best man. "I never loved her. Just need her family's fortune." Instead of calling it off, she went through with it, only to sign a prenup that left him with nothing. At the altar, she exposed his betrayal to everyone. Eleanor Hastings had always been a woman who measured her steps carefully. In a world where appearances were currency and power dictated relationships, she had been raised to be poised, intelligent, and unshakable. As the only daughter of Charles Hastings, a real estate magnate with a net worth that made even old money families pause, Eleanor was accustomed to moving through life with precision. She had been taught from a young age that trust was a privilege, not a given, and that love, as much as people like to romanticize it, was often a transaction. She had believed herself above the games played by the elite, until Daniel Kensington. Daniel had entered her life like a carefully crafted dream. He was the type of man who could make anyone believe in love, and Eleanor, for all her intelligence, had been no exception. He was devastatingly handsome, with sharp features, dark eyes that seemed to see through people, and a presence that could command any room. More than that, he was charming, so effortlessly charismatic that he made women forget themselves in his presence. And Eleanor, despite her skepticism about men like him, had fallen. Their courtship had been swift but intoxicating. Lavish trips to Italy and Greece, dinners in Michelin-starred restaurants where they whispered to each other over candlelight, stolen moments of laughter that made Eleanor feel like she had finally found something real. Daniel had known exactly what to say, exactly how to look at her to make her believe that she wasn't just another wealthy heiress being pursued for her family's fortune. He had convinced her that, for once, she was being loved for herself, not for the empire she would one day inherit. Her parents had been cautiously approving. They had done their due diligence, of course, background checks, private investigations, discreet inquiries among business circles. Daniel was from a once powerful family, but their wealth had taken a significant hit over the years. Still, he was well-bred, well-educated, and had just enough remaining status to be considered an acceptable match. Her father had warned her, though, in the way fathers do when they sense something their daughters cannot. "Be careful, Eleanor. Men who come from dwindling fortunes often seek to replenish them in ways that aren't always noble." She had brushed off his concerns, attributing them to his inherent distrust of people who weren't self-made. Now, on the eve of her wedding, Eleanor stood at the grand estate her family had secured for the occasion. The preparations had been meticulous, every detail crafted to perfection. The ballroom was a masterpiece of gold and ivory, filled with towering arrangements of white roses and crystal chandeliers that cast a soft, ethereal glow over the room. The guest list was a collection of the city's most powerful, the kind of people who could make or break reputations with a single conversation. Everything about the wedding was designed to be a spectacle, a statement of power and union between two families of prestige. And yet, despite the perfection of it all, Eleanor couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. It wasn't anything tangible, nothing she could put into words, just a quiet unease that had settled into her chest over the past few weeks. Daniel had been different, not in a way that most would notice, but Eleanor had spent enough time with him to pick up on the subtleties. There was a sharpness to his smiles that hadn't been there before, a certain impatience in the way he spoke about their future. She had convinced herself it was pre-wedding stress. Everyone said that doubt was normal before such a significant life change, that nerves could make even the strongest relationships feel fragile. But as she made her way down the dimly lit hall of the estate, heading toward her private suite, she heard something that made her blood turn cold. Laughter. It was coming from the study, a rich, amused chuckle, followed by the unmistakable sound of Daniel's voice. Eleanor slowed her steps, the instinct to turn away warring with the sudden, sickening curiosity that had taken hold of her. The door was slightly ajar, just enough for her to see the warm glow of the chandelier inside, illuminating the figures within. She recognized them immediately, Daniel and James Waverley, his best man and closest confidant. She should have walked away, should have ignored the nagging feeling clawing at her stomach, but something about the way they were laughing, the sharp edge of amusement in their voices, kept her rooted to the spot. "I still can't believe you actually pulled it off," James was saying, amusement thick in his voice. You, of all people. The great Daniel Kensington, playing the devoted fiancé. Daniel let out a soft chuckle, the kind that had once made Eleanor's heart flutter. Now, it sent a chill down her spine. Come on, James, he said smoothly. Did you really think I'd let an opportunity like this slip by? Eleanor Hastings is the golden ticket. She's practically handing me the key to her family's empire. Eleanor's breath hitched. James hummed, swirling his drink in his glass. And you're sure about this? You're really going through with it? Daniel scoffed. Why wouldn't I? A year, maybe less. Then I'll file for divorce and take my half. That's the beauty of it. She actually believes I love her. She felt like the floor had been ripped out from under her. Her heartbeat roared in her ears, drowning out the rest of the conversation. She stood frozen, her breath shallow, her vision blurring at the edges. Every word that had just come from Daniel's mouth replayed in her mind, over and over, like a sickening echo. A year. Take my half. She actually believes I love her. Eleanor didn't realize she was shaking until she clenched her hands into fists, nails digging so hard into her palm that she nearly broke the skin. How dare he? How dare he? She had been prepared to give him everything, to love him without question, to build a life together. And the entire time, he had been planning his escape, his payout. It was never about her. It was about what she could give him, what he could take. A hot wave of fury burned through her, sharp and consuming. Every instinct in her body screamed at her to storm into that room, to slap the smug expression off his face, to tear apart the illusion he had so carefully built. But no, she wouldn't give him the satisfaction. She had spent her entire life learning how to control herself, how to be composed, strategic, unshakable. And she would not shatter now. No, she would give him exactly what he wanted. She would walk down the aisle. She would smile as he slipped the ring onto her finger. She would let him believe, for just a little longer, that he had one. And then, when he least expected it, she would take it all away. Her expression smoothed, the fire in her chest cooling into something far more dangerous. Calculated. Methodical. She turned on her heel, her decision made. Daniel Kensington thought he was playing her. He had no idea what game he had just started. Imagine standing at the altar, knowing the man beside you is a fraud. What would you do? Would you go through with the wedding like Eleanor? Or would you expose him right away? Let me know in the comments. And if you're loving this story, don't forget to like and subscribe for more. Eleanor barely felt her legs as she walked away from the study, her hands clenched so tightly at her sides that her nails threatened to pierce her skin. The quiet hum of the party downstairs drifted up the hall, laughter and the soft clinking of glasses mingling in the air, but she barely heard it. All she could hear was Daniel's voice echoing in her mind, every syllable of his betrayal cutting through her like a blade. She actually believes I love her. The words played on a loop, mocking her, reminding her of just how foolish she had been to let herself believe in the illusion of love. A part of her wanted to scream, to storm back into that room and throw his words in his face, demand to know if every kiss, every whispered promise, every stolen moment between them had been nothing more than an act. But she knew the answer already. If she walked in there, he would lie, just like he had been lying to her for months. He would tell her what she wanted to hear, weave another web of deception, and for what? To keep her blind until he had legally secured his claim to half of everything she owned? No, Eleanor refused to be a fool. She had been raised by a man who understood power, who had built an empire from the ground up and taught her that emotions were nothing more than leverage when used against the weak. And she refused to be weak. She reached her suite and closed the door behind her, the click of the lock sealing her in a space that suddenly felt suffocating. The grand four-poster bed, the silk sheets, the floral arrangements carefully selected for her, the champagne bottle on ice waiting to be opened in celebration of her final night as an unmarried woman. Everything was a lie. She pressed her fingers to her temples, forcing herself to breathe, forcing herself to think. This wasn't just about heartbreak. This was about war. And she needed a plan. Pulling her phone from the vanity, she scrolled through her contacts until she found the name she needed. Graham Lockwood, family attorney. The phone barely rang before he picked up. Eleanor? Everything all right? For a moment, she considered telling him the truth, that she was about to marry a man who had never loved her, who saw her as nothing more than a stepping stone to wealth, that she wanted to burn the entire wedding to the ground and watch Daniel choke on the ashes. But instead, she forced her voice into something measured, controlled. I need a favor, Graham. A last-minute amendment to the prenup. Something airtight. There was a pause on the other end, the kind that told her he was considering whether or not to question her. You sure about this? Your father already approved the original agreement. I'm sure, she said, her grip on the phone tightening. It needs to be ironclad. He gets nothing, no matter what happens. Another beat of silence. Then, I'll have it drawn up within the hour. You'll need to make sure he signs before the ceremony. No loopholes, Eleanor. If he refuses, he won't refuse, she cut in, her voice sharper than she intended. He'll sign it, Graham. Send it over when it's ready. She ended the call before he could say anything else, dropping the phone onto the vanity as she stared at her reflection in the mirror. The woman looking back at her was not the same woman she had been an hour ago. That woman had been excited about her future, had been blind enough to believe in something as foolish as love. This woman, the one sitting in front of her now, was something else entirely. Her lips curled slightly, the faintest ghost of a smile, though there was no warmth in it. She had spent too long playing the perfect fiancée, the devoted woman who trusted her soon-to-be husband with her heart. Now, she would play a different role. The night stretched on, the hours passing in a haze of quiet rage and careful calculation. The celebration downstairs had long since ended, guests retreating to their rooms in the estate or being chauffeured to their hotels. The air had shifted, the vibrant energy of the evening giving way to something calmer, quieter. Eleanor remained awake, staring at the ceiling as she lay in bed, every inch of her body coiled with anticipation. At 3 a.m., her phone lit up with a message. Prenup updated. Check your email. She sat up, swiping open her phone to scan the document. Graham had done exactly as she asked. The agreement was unbreakable, leaving Daniel with nothing in the event of a divorce. No assets, no stake in her family's business, no financial compensation. It was a legal coffin, and he had no idea he was about to walk into it willingly. Eleanor let out a slow breath, setting the phone aside as she climbed out of bed and walked toward the window, pulling back the curtain to stare out at the sprawling estate. The moon hung low in the sky, casting its pale light over the pristine gardens below. Somewhere in the distance, she could see the guest quarters where Daniel was sleeping, completely unaware of what was coming. She should have felt grief, should have felt the weight of heartbreak pressing down on her. But all she felt was resolve. As the first hints of dawn crept over the horizon, she turned away from the window and crawled back into bed. Tomorrow, she would wake up and walk down the aisle. She would smile for the cameras, recite her vows, and play her part perfectly. And when the moment came, when he signed that document in front of hundreds of people, she would watch as he unknowingly destroyed his own future. Daniel Kensington thought he had one. He had no idea the game had just begun. Eleanor opened her eyes to the soft glow of the morning sun filtering through the sheer curtains, her body heavy with exhaustion despite the few hours of restless sleep she had managed to get. For a fleeting moment, she allowed herself to exist in that space of half-consciousness, where the weight of reality hadn't yet settled over her. But then it did. Like a tidal wave crashing into her chest, the memory of last night returned with startling clarity, sending an immediate pulse of cold rage through her veins. The house was already alive with movement, a symphony of hurried footsteps, murmured conversations, and the occasional call of her name as preparations for the event of the season entered their final stretch. Eleanor lay still for a moment longer, staring at the ceiling, letting the noise wash over her before finally pulling herself out of bed. Today was the day. The day she was supposed to be the happiest woman in the world. The day the world would watch her become Mrs. Eleanor Kensington. The day Daniel would think he had secured his fortune, until the moment she took it all away from him. She walked toward the vanity, her fingers brushing over the perfectly arranged jewelry, the delicate lace veil waiting to be placed over her head, the sparkling tiara that had once symbolized a fairy tale she no longer believed in. Her reflection in the mirror was calm, almost too calm, her face giving away none of the war raging inside her. A knock at the door. She turned, smoothing down the silk robe draped over her frame before answering. "Good morning, sweetheart," her mother, Catherine Hastings, greeted as she stepped inside, a warm yet critical gaze sweeping over Eleanor's face. "You look pale. Did you sleep at all?" Eleanor forced a small smile, walking to the window, her back to her mother so she wouldn't see the lie in her eyes. "Barely. Too much excitement, I suppose," Catherine sighed, her heels clicking softly against the floor as she approached. "I remember the night before my wedding. The nerves, the anticipation. But it's worth it. Marriage is a partnership, Eleanor. A powerful one when chosen wisely." Her voice lowered slightly, her hands gently adjusting a curl that had fallen from Eleanor's hair. "Daniel is a good match. Despite his family situation, he carries himself like a true Kensington. I trust that you know what you're doing." Eleanor swallowed the bitter laugh that nearly escaped her lips. If only her mother knew the truth, knew that the man she believed to be a worthy partner was nothing more than a snake in an expensive suit. But Eleanor had played this game long enough to know that revealing the truth now would only cause chaos. The moment for destruction would come soon enough. "I do," she said simply, turning to meet her mother's eyes. "I know exactly what I'm doing." Her mother studied her for a moment, as if sensing something beneath her words, but she didn't press. Instead, she kissed Eleanor's cheek and whispered, "Then let's make today perfect." Perfect. The morning passed in a blur of orchestrated chaos, stylists bustling in and out, final preparations being made downstairs, the sound of laughter and conversation drifting through the halls as guests arrived and were escorted to the grand garden where the ceremony would take place. Eleanor let herself be guided through the motions, sitting still as her makeup was applied, nodding absently as her hair was styled into soft waves. But her mind was elsewhere, replaying Daniel's voice from the night before, his arrogance, his certainty that she was nothing more than an easy target. "Eleanor, we need to go over a few last-minute details." Her father's voice cut through her thoughts as he stepped into the room, his expression unreadable. Charles Hastings was not a man who showed emotion easily, and today was no exception. She stood, smoothing her hands down the satin bodice of her gown. "Of course." He glanced at the stylists, and they immediately took the hint, gathering their supplies before making a quick exit, leaving them alone. "I received a call this morning from Graham," he said, watching her carefully. "He told me you made changes to the prenuptial agreement." Eleanor's stomach clenched, but she kept her face composed. "I did." Charles crossed the room, hands clasped behind his back. "Why?" She met his gaze, unwavering. "Because I wanted to." A beat of silence stretched between them. Then, after a long sigh, her father nodded slowly. "Good." Eleanor blinked. "Good. I was going to ask Graham to do the same thing, but you beat me to it," he admitted, his lips twitching in something that almost resembled pride. "I may not know the full details, but I know a man like Daniel when I see one. He thinks he's smarter than you. He thinks he's already won." She exhaled, a quiet understanding passing between them. For all his faults, Charles Hastings had always seen the world for what it was. He didn't believe in romance. He believed in power. And today, she would prove that she was his daughter in every way. The ceremony was set to begin in less than an hour. Outside, the world was waiting. Daniel was waiting. And Eleanor? Eleanor was ready. The moment she stepped outside, a wave of applause and murmured admiration greeted her. The estate's gardens had been transformed into a scene from a dream. White roses cascading from towering arches, golden chairs arranged in perfect symmetry, the aisle lined with soft candlelight despite the daylight. At the end of it stood Daniel, dressed in a custom-tailored tuxedo, exuding effortless confidence. To the rest of the world, he looked like a man in love, a man eager to make his vows. But to Eleanor, he looked like prey. As she walked down the aisle, her fingers tightened around her bouquet, her heart pounding not with nervousness, but with anticipation. Each step brought her closer to the moment that would change everything. She could see the smirk hiding in the corners of Daniel's mouth, the certainty in his eyes that today was the day he secured his future. She smiled at him as she reached the altar, her expression serene, giving him no reason to suspect a thing. The priest's voice was a dull hum in the background as the ceremony began, but Eleanor barely heard it, her mind locked on the one moment that mattered. The moment Daniel would sign. The vows were exchanged, the rings slipped onto fingers, and then the moment arrived. Before we proceed, there is one last formality, Eleanor said smoothly, her voice carrying through the hushed crowd. She turned to Daniel, her hands steady as she retrieved the elegantly bound document from her father's outstretched hand. The prenuptial agreement. There was a flicker of something in Daniel's eyes. Hesitation? Surprise? But it was gone just as quickly, replaced by his signature easy confidence. He took the pen, barely glancing at the papers before signing his name with a flourish. Eleanor watched him, savoring the moment. He had just sealed his fate. She reached for the document, carefully folding it before handing it back to Graham, her movements slow, deliberate. Then, she turned back to Daniel and smiled. "Shall we continue?" The words tasted like victory. The air was thick with anticipation as Eleanor stood before Daniel, her smile carefully composed, betraying nothing of the storm raging beneath her skin. The guests watched with admiration, their eyes reflecting the dreamlike perfection of the wedding unfolding before them. If anyone suspected that something was amiss, they didn't show it. To them, this was the union of two powerful families, a moment of love and commitment, a day destined to be remembered. Daniel, standing tall beside her, exuded the confidence of a man who believed he had already won. He had spent months weaving his web, making sure every detail of this marriage led him to exactly where he wanted to be. And now, with hundreds of witnesses, with her father watching approvingly from the front row, with the ink still fresh on the prenuptial agreement he had signed without a second thought, he had no reason to suspect that the ground beneath him had already begun to crack. Eleanor's heart pounded as the priest's voice filled the silence, solemn and steady, carrying through the grand garden where the ceremony was being held. "Do you, Daniel Kensington, take Eleanor Hastings to be your lawfully wedded wife? To love, honor, and cherish, in sickness and in health, for as long as you both shall live?" A smile curled at the edge of Daniel's lips, practiced, effortless. "I do." Eleanor felt the heat of his gaze settle on her as the priest turned to her. "And do you, Eleanor Hastings, take Daniel Kensington to be your lawfully wedded husband? To love, honor, and cherish, in sickness and in health, for as long as you both shall live?" She let the pause stretch just long enough for Daniel to notice. She saw the flicker of confusion in his eyes, the way his fingers twitched slightly at his side. She could almost hear the thoughts racing through his head. Why was she hesitating? Then, with a slow, deliberate breath, she lifted her gaze to meet his. And she smiled. "I do." The relief that flashed across Daniel's face was brief, but telling. He had expected something, perhaps the faintest whisper of doubt, perhaps a hesitation that would make him question whether she was as blind as he thought. But her voice was steady, her expression flawless. The priest nodded approvingly. "By the power vested in me, I now pronounce you husband and wife." Applause erupted through the garden, champagne glasses lifted in celebration, cheers of admiration ringing in the air. Eleanor barely registered any of it. Her eyes were locked on Daniel's, memorizing the exact moment his arrogance would turn to dust. "You may kiss the bride." Daniel leaned in, confident, victorious. Eleanor allowed it, let his lips brush against hers in a performance so perfectly executed that even the sharpest eyes wouldn't see the truth. She tasted the deception on his lips, felt the smugness in the way he lingered, as if savoring his triumph. She pulled away first, turning to the guests, raising her joined hands with Daniel in what appeared to be a gesture of celebration. The applause swelled. Cameras flashed. The world saw nothing but a fairy tale. And then, with effortless grace, Eleanor stepped forward, her voice cutting through the celebration like the sharp edge of a knife. "There's something I'd like to say." The room stilled. The whispers died down. Even the musicians, who had just begun to play, faltered and let the melody fade into silence. Daniel tensed beside her. She felt it, the slight shift in his posture, the quickened breath, the realization that something was happening outside of his carefully controlled script. She turned to face the crowd, keeping her expression warm, her voice steady. I wanted to take a moment to thank all of you for being here today. This wedding is not just about love. It's about family, about trust, about the foundation upon which a lifelong partnership is built. She let her eyes drift over the guests, let the weight of her words settle. Then, slowly, she turned her head toward Daniel, tilting her head ever so slightly. And of course, it's about honesty. Daniel's smile flickered. Eleanor reached down, lifting the neatly bound document that had been resting on a table beside them. Earlier today, my new husband signed a prenuptial agreement. A very important one. She let the words sink in, watching as a murmur spread through the guests, as a few exchanged curious glances. Daniel let out a quiet chuckle, low and controlled, the kind meant to diffuse tension. Eleanor, sweetheart, I don't think this is really. She cut him off with a single glance. You signed it without question, without hesitation, trusting that it was a simple formality. Her fingers traced the edge of the papers, a slow, deliberate movement. That was a mistake. The murmur grew louder. Daniel's hand twitched at his side. Eleanor, he said, his voice quieter now, just for her. What are you doing? She met his gaze, holding it, letting him see the answer in her eyes before she spoke. I'm giving you exactly what you deserve. And then, she lifted the microphone in her other hand and pressed play. The recording filled the air. Daniel's voice, clear and unmistakable. I never loved her. Eleanor Hastings is the golden ticket. 6 months, maybe a year, then I'll file for divorce and take my half. That's the beauty of it. She actually believes I love her. Gasps. Shocked whispers. The unmistakable sound of someone dropping their champagne glass, the delicate shatter lost beneath the tidal wave of scandal. Daniel went rigid beside her. The blood drained from his face, his eyes wide, his lips parting as if searching for words that wouldn't come. Eleanor tilted her head slightly, feigning curiosity. Daniel? You look surprised. He moved then, reaching for the microphone, for her arm, for anything that might stop this from happening. But she stepped back, raising a hand as if dismissing a man who no longer held a place in her world. I wonder, she continued, letting the venom seep into her tone, how different your signature might have looked this morning if you had known that, in the event of our divorce, you would receive absolutely nothing. The final blow. The words that shattered what little hope Daniel had left. The world seemed to slow as he realized it, as the truth crashed down on him in front of hundreds of witnesses. His betrayal wasn't just exposed. It was now a public execution. Eleanor turned back to the crowd, her expression effortlessly composed. Ladies and gentlemen, please, continue enjoying the evening. After all, this is a celebration. She raised her glass, a silent invitation for the guests to do the same. A few hesitated, unsure, but then the first toast was made, and then another. The music swelled again, laughter rippling through the air. Not the joyful kind, but the sharp, knowing laughter of those who had just witnessed the fall of a man who had thought himself untouchable. Daniel stood frozen beside her, jaw clenched, fingers curled into tight fists. She leaned in one last time, her voice low, just for him. You thought you were playing me, she murmured, her lips barely moving, her tone dripping with victory. You were never even in the game. And with that, Eleanor turned away, stepping off the altar, leaving Daniel alone in the ruins of the future he had so carefully planned. The night was still young. The celebration would continue. But for Daniel Kensington, the dream was already over. Daniel's world collapsed around him in slow motion. The weight of the whispers, the laughter laced with disbelief, the sharp glances thrown his way. It all settled onto his chest like a boulder, crushing the confidence he had walked into this marriage with. Just minutes ago, he had stood before hundreds of guests, basking in the admiration, in the sheer certainty that today was the pinnacle of his success. Now, he was exposed, humiliated, nothing more than a fraud with nowhere to run. His hands trembled at his sides, his mind scrambling for damage control, for a way to twist this, to regain control, but there was nothing. No words, no explanations, no charming lie that could undo what Eleanor had just done. The woman he had thought was an easy mark, a perfect victim, now stood in front of him. Her posture effortless, her expression unreadable, a picture of grace even as she single-handedly ripped his life apart. The applause had faded, the carefully curated smiles of the guests replaced with fascination, with curiosity, with an amusement they didn't even try to hide. Eleanor had given them a spectacle, a scandal they would be talking about for years, and Daniel was the unwilling star of the show. His mother, seated at the front with her signature poise, had gone deathly still, her fingers tightening around the stem of her champagne flute. His father, once a man of influence before their wealth had begun to fade, looked away, jaw clenched in barely concealed disappointment. His best man, James Waverley, who had been standing beside him just moments ago, took an imperceptible step back as if distancing himself from the sinking ship that was Daniel Kensington. Eleanor turned, handing the microphone back to the event coordinator with a polite smile before picking up a fresh champagne flute from a passing waiter. She moved with ease, as if she hadn't just detonated a bomb in the middle of her own wedding, as if she wasn't standing beside the man she had just publicly ruined. The contrast between them was staggering. Where Daniel stood frozen, his face drained of color, she was radiant, completely unbothered. He tried to breathe, to pull himself together, to find his voice. But before he could form a coherent thought, Eleanor was already speaking again, her voice smooth and controlled as she addressed the guests. "I want to thank you all for being here today," she said, lifting her glass slightly, her eyes sweeping over the crowd. "I know this isn't quite the wedding reception you expected, but I do hope you'll stay and enjoy the evening nonetheless." A ripple of polite laughter spread through the guests, uncertain but willing to follow Eleanor's lead. Daniel's head snapped toward her, his mouth opening, his voice finally returning, though it was quieter, almost desperate. "Eleanor," he murmured, his words barely audible beneath the noise, his hands twitching at his sides as if reaching for something that was already gone. "We should talk." Eleanor turned her head slightly, her gaze meeting his for the first time since she had revealed the truth. For a brief second, he thought he saw something there, something beyond the calculated coldness, pain, perhaps, or the remnants of what had once been trust. But then it was gone, replaced by something else entirely. Amusement. Victory. "Talk?" she repeated, tilting her head, her lips curling into the faintest ghost of a smile. "Oh, Daniel, we have nothing to talk about." The word struck him harder than he expected. He had seen this woman in every shade of emotion. Softness, love, desire, even the occasional frustration that came with any relationship. But this was new. This was a version of Eleanor Hastings he had never encountered before, one he had never even considered. And he realized, with a sinking weight in his stomach, that he had never really known her at all. The waitstaff moved with well-rehearsed precision, refilling glasses, ensuring the flow of the evening continued uninterrupted. The band resumed playing a low, elegant tune, the soft hum of conversation beginning to stir again, as if the crowd had collectively decided to embrace the scandal rather than recoil from it. Daniel clenched his fists, the remnants of his pride still grasping for control. "You planned this," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, edged with something sharp, something desperate. Eleanor's smile didn't falter. "Of course I did." He exhaled sharply, his mind spinning, his pulse pounding. "How long have you known?" "Long enough," she said simply, taking a sip of her champagne. His jaw clenched. "You let me go through with the wedding. You let me think." He stopped himself, swallowing back the anger rising in his throat. He had spent so much time believing he was the one orchestrating this game, the one pulling the strings, but now he saw it for what it was. He had never been in control. Not once. Eleanor leaned in slightly, her voice lower, just for him. "You thought you could manipulate me, Daniel. That I would be like all the other women you've deceived, blinded by love and wealth. But I saw you for what you were the moment I heard you plotting my downfall." She let the words sink in, watching as his shoulders tensed. "So I decided to let you walk straight into your own trap." Daniel's breathing grew uneven. This isn't over. Eleanor chuckled, the sound so soft, so effortless, that it sent a chill through him. Oh, but it is, she murmured. You signed the prenup. You have nothing. And there it was, the final nail in the coffin. Daniel had always considered himself a man who could adapt, who could recover from any setback. But this? There was no coming back from this. His name, his reputation, his standing in high society. Everything was crumbling before his eyes, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. Eleanor took one last sip of her champagne before setting the glass down and turning away, walking toward her father, who stood at the edge of the garden with an expression that was equal parts amused and impressed. As she reached him, he offered her a slow nod. Well played, Charles Hastings said simply, his voice laced with something almost resembling pride. Eleanor exhaled, the tension in her shoulders easing slightly, but she didn't allow herself to feel relief just yet. There was still more to be done. She cast one last glance over her shoulder, watching as Daniel stood frozen amidst the crowd, his carefully constructed world collapsing around him. She had won. But this was only the beginning. The walls were closing in, suffocating, crushing. Daniel Kensington stood frozen in the center of a world that was no longer his, the echo of Eleanor's words still ringing in his ears. He could hear the guests murmuring, laughter laced with amusement, the clinking of champagne glasses as the people around him drank to his humiliation. He had walked into this wedding expecting to claim his prize, and instead, he had been paraded through the grandest halls of high society as nothing more than a fool. His heart pounded violently, his palms damp with sweat, the slow realization creeping over him that everything he had worked for was slipping through his fingers. He needed to act, to do something, anything, to stop this. His mind raced, searching for a way out, an explanation, a lie smooth enough to undo the damage, but there was none. The people surrounding him were no longer allies, no longer admirers. He could feel their eyes on him, feel the shift in the air. The looks they gave him now weren't those of respect or envy. They were filled with mockery, with quiet satisfaction, as if they had always known that one day, the mighty Daniel Kensington would fall. His mother's expression was unreadable, her lips pressed into a thin line, the slightest furrow between her brows betraying her fury. His father, once a man of power, now merely a remnant of the wealth their family had lost, sat motionless, his gaze distant, as though he had already begun erasing Daniel from his mind. And James, his best man, the one person who should have been at his side, had stepped away, shaking his head slightly, as if finally admitting that this had been inevitable. Daniel clenched his fists at his sides, forcing himself to breathe, to suppress the wave of nausea rising in his throat. He had never tasted failure before. Not like this. Not with an audience. His gaze locked onto Eleanor, standing effortlessly poised, her expression calm, a quiet storm brewing behind her eyes. She wasn't gloating, wasn't smirking in victory. That would have been easier to stomach. No, her eyes told him something far worse. This wasn't just revenge for her. This was justice. This was punishment. And she had executed it flawlessly. He took a step toward her, his voice low, urgent, the mask of composure still barely holding together. We need to talk. Eleanor didn't move, didn't even blink, as if his words meant nothing, as if he meant nothing. The silence stretched between them, thick and heavy, the weight of it pressing against his ribs. Then, finally, she spoke, her tone smooth, almost gentle. I don't think we do. His pulse roared in his ears. Eleanor, she tilted her head slightly, considering him, as if seeing him for the first time. You thought you could manipulate me, she mused, her voice barely above a whisper, yet sharp enough to slice through him. You thought I was just another woman you could deceive. Another name on a list of conquests. She let the words linger, watching as his jaw tightened. But I'm not them. I was never them. Daniel swallowed hard, fighting to keep his breathing steady, but it was useless. He could feel it slipping, the last remnants of control he had left. You don't have to do this, he said, his voice quiet, desperate now, no longer the smooth, confident drawl he had always wielded like a weapon. We can fix this. We can talk about." Eleanor laughed then, soft and cruel. And for the first time since this nightmare had begun, he felt true fear. "Daniel," she interrupted, her smile unwavering, her eyes merciless. "There is no weep anymore." There never was. The finality in her voice sent a chill down his spine. The world around him blurred, the murmurs of the crowd growing distant, the music playing softly in the background feeling like an eerie soundtrack to his downfall. He had always thought of himself as the one in control, the one who dictated the course of his life. But now, standing in the wreckage of his own making, he realized how wrong he had been. She turned away from him, her attention already elsewhere, already moving on, as if he were nothing more than a footnote in her story. The dismissal was worse than any public humiliation, worse than any words she could have thrown at him. His throat tightened as he took a step back, his mind screaming at him to salvage something, anything. But there was nothing left to salvage. A waiter passed by, offering him a glass of champagne, completely unaware of the storm raging inside him. He almost laughed at the absurdity of it. He was supposed to be celebrating tonight. Instead, he was choking on the ashes of his failure. His phone buzzed in his pocket, and he pulled it out with shaking hands. A message from his mother. "Fix this. Fix this." The words burned into his mind. But how? How did he fix something that had already crumbled beyond repair? How did he undo a destruction so precise, so merciless, that there was nothing left to hold on to? The laughter of the guests grew louder, the whispers more pointed. He turned on his heel, pushing past them, ignoring the amused glances, the pitiful looks. He needed to get out, needed to breathe. He barely registered the cool night air as he stepped outside, his footsteps quick, unsteady. The grand estate loomed behind him, a monument to everything he had lost. Beyond the gates, reporters had already gathered, cameras flashing, eager to capture the fallen groom. The story had spread. He could already see the headlines. Daniel Kensington, the man who lost it all. His hands trembled as he ran them through his hair, his chest tightening, the full weight of reality crashing down on him. He had nothing. No leverage, no wealth, no way to twist the narrative in his favor. The Kensington name had been fading for years, and now he had delivered the final blow himself. He turned his head, glancing back toward the house, toward the warm glow of the ballroom where the reception continued without him. Eleanor was still inside, still glowing under the lights, still untouchable. And he was nothing more than a ghost, a man who had gambled everything and lost. For the first time in his life, Daniel Kensington had no backup plan. And for the first time in his life, he was truly alone. The scent of roses and champagne lingered in the air as Eleanor moved effortlessly through the reception, the echoes of laughter and conversation surrounding her like a symphony. She felt the weight of 100 eyes following her every move, some filled with admiration, others with curiosity, and a few with thinly veiled envy. The whispers had not stopped since she had publicly dismantled Daniel Kensington's carefully constructed illusion, and she knew they wouldn't stop for a long time. But she didn't care. Not tonight. Tonight, she was free. She exhaled, slowly, savoring the crisp evening air as she stepped onto the terrace, the estate's garden stretching before her, illuminated by soft golden lights that flickered like stars in the distance. The music from inside drifted through the open doors, blending with the rustling of the trees and the faint clinking of glasses as the guests continued their celebrations. It was ironic. Really, this had been meant to be her wedding night, the start of a new life with a man she thought she had loved. Instead, it had become something far greater, a statement, a reckoning. Her father's voice pulled her from her thoughts, deep and steady as he approached. "Well," Charles Hastings murmured, stepping beside her, hands clasped behind his back as he surveyed the crowd. "I have to say, that was a hell of a performance." Eleanor let out a quiet laugh, shaking her head. "It wasn't a performance." He glanced at her then, the corners of his mouth lifting in something that was not quite a smile. "Wasn't it?" She turned to face him fully, studying the sharp lines of his face, the calculating intelligence in his eyes, so much like her own. Charles Hastings was not a man who believed in love. He believed in power, in control, in ensuring that no one ever had the ability to take what was his. And though Eleanor had spent years convincing herself that she was different, that she wanted something more than just strategic alliances and measured partnerships, tonight had proven otherwise. She had learned his lessons well. "I suppose you were right about him," she admitted finally, her voice quieter now, almost contemplative. Charles let out a small hum. Not smug, not gloating, just knowing. "I usually am," Eleanor sighed, leaning slightly against the railing, fingers tracing the cool stone. "And yet, I walked into this knowing better." Her father was silent for a moment before he spoke again, softer this time. "Knowing better doesn't always stop us from wanting to believe." She frowned slightly, surprised by the almost gentle edge to his tone. It wasn't often that Charles Hastings acknowledged vulnerability, even in passing. He took a sip of his whiskey, then gestured toward the crowd below. "You handled yourself well tonight. You turned what could have been a disaster into a display of strength. But now, people will be watching you more closely than ever." Eleanor nodded. "Let them watch." A brief silence stretched between them before Charles chuckled, shaking his head. "Your mother is furious, you know." She smirked. "She'll get over it." Charles didn't argue. Instead, he gave her a long, measured look. "So, what now?" Eleanor exhaled slowly, letting the question settle in her mind. What now? For months, her entire life had revolved around Daniel, around wedding preparations, around building a future that had never truly existed. And now that the illusion was gone, the path ahead of her felt open, uncertain, thrilling. She straightened, meeting her father's gaze with quiet determination. "Now," she said, "I rebuild." A slow nod of approval. "Good." And with that, Charles Hastings turned and disappeared back into the reception, leaving Eleanor alone with her thoughts once more. She stood there for a while longer, letting the night wrap around her, letting the reality of her decision settle into her bones. She had done it. She had reclaimed herself. She had turned what could have been her greatest humiliation into her greatest triumph. And yet, as freeing as it was, there was still something lingering at the edges of her mind. A whisper of doubt. A question she hadn't allowed herself to ask. Would she ever trust again? The thought was interrupted by the sound of approaching footsteps, measured and slow. The kind of steps belonging to someone who was in no hurry, someone who knew they would be noticed. She turned slightly, her eyes landing on James Waverly, her former fiancé's best man. James had been a silent observer for most of the evening, watching from the edges, never interfering, never taking a side. But now, as he leaned casually against the railing beside her, there was something unreadable in his gaze, something that made her pause. "You know," he said, his voice low, thoughtful, "if you ever get tired of weddings, you could always go into theater." Eleanor arched a brow. "Is that supposed to be a compliment?" He smirked. "Depends. Did it sound like one?" She huffed a quiet laugh, shaking her head. "I should have known you'd come find me eventually." James tilted his head slightly, studying her. "And why's that?" She met his gaze, holding it. "Because you're the only person in that room who wasn't surprised." A slow, knowing smile. "No," he admitted, "I wasn't." Eleanor searched his face, waiting for him to elaborate, to explain why he had never seemed entirely convinced by Daniel's act, why he had always seemed like he was waiting for something to unravel. But he didn't say anything more. Instead, he took a sip of his drink, eyes still locked on hers, amusement flickering in their depths. "What do you want, James?" she asked, her tone steady, unwavering. He considered the question for a moment before answering. "Right now? A dance." Eleanor blinked. "A dance?" He nodded toward the ballroom, where the music was still playing, where couples still moved together in slow, practiced steps. "You did just ruin your own wedding. Seems like a waste not to enjoy the reception." She studied him, searching for an ulterior motive, for a hidden agenda. But if there was one, she couldn't see it. And maybe that was the most interesting thing of all. Finally, she exhaled, setting down her glass. "One dance." James grinned. "One dance." And as she took his offered hand and let him lead her back inside, Eleanor realized something. Her story wasn't over. It was just beginning. The world outside the estate was colder than Daniel had expected. Or maybe it was just the sharp bite of humiliation settling deep into his bones. The once luxurious jacket he wore felt like a burden, heavy with the weight of expectations that had crumbled before his eyes. His hands were shoved into his pockets, fingers curled tightly as he paced near the gated entrance, his mind racing in circles, replaying every moment of the disaster that had unfolded inside. The echo of Eleanor's voice still lingered, cutting through his thoughts like a knife. He had never considered losing. Not really. He had crafted his life around careful manipulation, always 3 steps ahead, always maneuvering his way into power, into fortune, into the lives of people who had something he could take. But he had miscalculated. He had underestimated Eleanor. And now, standing outside the very estate where he was meant to celebrate his triumph, he realized he had nothing left to cling to. His phone buzzed again, and he already knew who it was before he looked. His mother. Fix this. The words were blunt, sharp, and filled with the same cold disappointment he had spent his life avoiding. He stared at the screen, jaw tightening, before shoving the phone back into his pocket without replying. How was he supposed to fix this? Eleanor had taken everything. His credibility, his plan, his future, and she had done it with a smile. He could already imagine the articles that would be published by morning. His downfall wouldn't just be a whispered scandal among the elite. It would be a public execution. He dragged a hand down his face, exhaling sharply before forcing himself to move. He had to talk to her. He had to make her see reason. There had to be something left, some leverage, some opening that he could use. He refused to believe it was over. He stepped back inside through a quieter entrance, avoiding the grand ballroom where the reception was still in full swing. The sound of laughter and music grated against his nerves as he moved through the halls, past familiar rooms now filled with people who had already forgotten him. He found her near the private lounge, speaking with an older couple he recognized as family friends. She looked effortless, as if tonight had been nothing more than a minor inconvenience rather than the complete dismantling of a marriage before it had even begun. Her dress still clung perfectly to her frame, not a single strand of hair out of place, her expression one of quiet victory. For a moment, he hesitated. There had been a time when that look had been meant for him, when she had gazed at him with admiration, with trust. And for the briefest second, he allowed himself to wonder what it would have been like if he had truly loved her, if he had played his part with sincerity instead of deception. But he shoved the thought away before it could take root. The couple excused themselves, and as Eleanor turned, her gaze landed on him. He saw the flicker of recognition, the subtle shift in her posture. But there was no surprise. She had expected him to come. Of course, she had. "Daniel," she greeted smoothly, taking a slow sip of her champagne. "Shouldn't you be finding your exit?" He ignored the bite in her words, stepping closer, lowering his voice. "We need to talk." Eleanor arched a delicate brow. "Talk?" She tilted her head slightly, amusement flickering in her eyes. What could we possibly have left to discuss? He inhaled slowly, steadying himself, forcing back the frustration clawing at his chest. "You got what you wanted," he said carefully. "You humiliated me, made your point. But this doesn't have to be the end." She blinked at him, then let out a quiet laugh, shaking her head. "You're unbelievable." Daniel clenched his jaw. "Eleanor, you still think you have something to bargain with," she interrupted, her voice soft but cutting. "That there's still a version of this where you walk away with something?" She leaned in slightly, just enough that he could smell the faint scent of her perfume, just enough that her next words would hit their mark. "But there isn't." His hands curled into fists at his sides. "I could fight the prenup," he said, though the words felt weak even as they left his lips. She tilted her head, considering him, before smirking. "You could try." Then, her voice dropped, colder now. "But you won't win." The confidence in her tone sent a fresh wave of rage through him. He had never felt powerless before, never known what it was like to be completely and utterly at someone else's mercy. But Eleanor held all the cards now, and she knew it. He took a step back, exhaling sharply, his pulse pounding in his ears. "You'll regret this." Eleanor met his gaze without hesitation. "No," she said simply, taking another sip of her drink. "I won't." The words were final. The conversation was over. Daniel turned, shoving past a few lingering guests, his vision blurring at the edges. His mother's voice echoed in his head, sharp and unforgiving. "Fix this." But there was no fixing this. He had lost. The walk to the exit felt longer than it should have, each step heavier than the last. He pushed open the doors, stepping back into the cold night air, his mind racing through every possible next move, every scenario where he still came out on top. But none of them felt real. None of them felt like anything but desperate, empty fantasies. As he reached the front gates, a black town car was already waiting, the driver standing beside it, waiting for him. No words were exchanged as the door was opened, and he slid inside, the leather seats cool against his skin. The estate loomed behind him, glowing under the soft golden lights, filled with the people who had once admired him, who had once believed he was something greater than what he truly was. And inside, Eleanor stood victorious, untouchable, free. Daniel clenched his jaw as the car pulled away, his fists tightening in his lap. He had spent his life manipulating others, bending the world to his will. But tonight, for the first time, he had been the one outplayed, and he wasn't sure if he would ever recover from it. A year had passed, but to Eleanor Hastings, it felt like a lifetime. The woman who had stood at the altar 12 months ago, poised but unsuspecting, was no longer the same. That version of her had been meticulously trained to be the perfect heiress, the ideal wife, a woman sculpted by expectation rather than by her own design. That woman had been betrayed, humiliated, and left to either crumble or rebuild. Eleanor had chosen to rebuild. She stepped out of the town car, the cool evening air brushing against her skin as she adjusted the sleek black gown that draped her figure effortlessly. The gala was already in full swing, a grand affair held in one of the most prestigious venues in the city, an event filled with those who had once whispered about her downfall, who had predicted she would retreat, who had waited for her to fade into obscurity. And yet, here she was, not as someone's fiancée, not as someone's almost wife, but as Eleanor Hastings, more powerful, more in control than she had ever been. The moment she walked into the grand hall, heads turned. Some faces held curiosity, others admiration, and a few wore the unmistakable tight smiles of those who had once doubted her. She had seen the articles written in the aftermath of that night. Some had called her ruthless, some had questioned whether she would recover, and some had even pitted her. She had ignored them all. Instead, she had taken control of the narrative, reclaiming herself in ways no one had expected. The past year had been a relentless climb. Instead of hiding behind her father's fortune, she had built something of her own. Her investment firm, once a quiet idea, had flourished into a force within the financial world, carefully selecting and funding projects that aligned with her vision. Her name, once only synonymous with old money and privilege, was now respected for reasons beyond her family's legacy. Eleanor Hastings was no longer just the daughter of Charles Hastings. She was an empire unto herself. A waiter passed by, offering her a flute of champagne, which she accepted with an easy nod, her eyes scanning the room. The conversations hummed around her, familiar faces mingling in tailored tuxedos and shimmering gowns. These were the same people who had once measured her worth by her engagement to Daniel Kensington. She wondered if they even realized how insignificant he had become in her story. She took a sip of her drink just as a familiar voice spoke from behind her. "You know, if you keep making this look so effortless, you're going to terrify half the men in this room." Eleanor turned, finding James Waverley standing beside her, a glass of whiskey in his hand and an amused glint in his eyes. He was as polished as ever, his black tuxedo perfectly fitted, his presence as effortless as the way he always seemed to find her in a crowd. She smirked. "Good. Let them be terrified." James chuckled, his gaze flickering over her with something that felt almost like approval. "I should have known you wouldn't just fade into the background after everything." Eleanor tilted her head slightly, watching him. "Did you think I would?" He took a slow sip of his drink, considering her. "No," he admitted. "I think I knew, even then, that you were always going to come out of this stronger." Something about the certainty in his voice made her pause, just for a fraction of a second. James had been there that night, had watched as Daniel's world came crumbling down. He hadn't interfered, hadn't taken a side, but he had seen everything. And in the months that followed, while others had fallen away, he had remained. Never pushing, never asking for more than she was willing to give. Just there. She exhaled, shaking off the weight of the past. It's strange, isn't it? She mused, glancing around the room. How quickly people forget their predictions. A year ago, they were convinced I would be a cautionary tale. Now, they act as if they always believed in me. James smirked. People have short memories when it comes to power. Eleanor hummed in agreement, taking another sip of her champagne. James studied her for a moment before speaking again, his voice quieter now. So, tell me, what's next for Eleanor Hastings? She let out a slow breath, letting the question settle in the space between them. For so long, her future had been dictated by others, by expectations, by obligations, by the carefully laid out path that had been chosen for her. But now, she stood on the edge of something entirely new. No arranged engagements, no partnerships built on deceit, no whispers telling her what she should do next. She turned her gaze back to James, a slow smile playing on her lips. I think, she said, that I'm finally going to do whatever I want. James chuckled, lifting his glass. To that then, they clinked their glasses together, the sound ringing softly between them. As the night stretched on, Eleanor allowed herself to simply exist in the moment. The weight of her past no longer clung to her, the shadow of betrayal no longer looming over her. She had not just survived, she had thrived. And while some stories ended in heartbreak, the best ones ended in power. And hers was just beginning.